Thank you so much to Engineer Nasser Al-Bari. What a great pleasure to have you here. And thank you so much for such inspiring words and for setting the tone for the rest of the day. Thank you once again to His Excellency as well as to Mr. Ala Al-Ali, and of course our final keynote there, Engineer Nasser Al-Bari, for officially opening EVIS 2024. Thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our first discussion, allow me to very quickly introduce myself. My name is Laura Buckwell, and I will be your MC for the next 3 days. And before we get underway, I'd like to highlight some housekeeping notes. So for any questions during our sessions, should time permit, we have standing microphones placed in the aisles. We will be breaking for lunch at around 1:15 for an hour or so. And we also have an app that has been especially made for the event today. So please do get that downloaded if you haven't done so already. Thank you once again to our keynote speakers for being with us here today as we move on now to our agenda and our discussion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, yes, as I mentioned, if you have not downloaded the app, please do make sure you get that downloaded. That's where you can navigate the show floor. You can read up on our speakers and exhibitors, and that's also where you can connect and also set up meetings. I have a special note for our delegates. If you're looking to earn CPD points today, don't forget to swing by the CPD table, which is just outside of this room. Make sure you have your badge to enter. It's a very simple step that will earn you credits for participating in the summit. Please do stay with us as we have a very exciting panel discussion ahead as well. If you would like to share anything that you've heard today, you can use our hashtag EVIS2024, and also you can tag EV Innovation Summit as well. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we start the day with a panel discussion. So to get some critical thinking going around the global challenges and opportunities across the EV landscape. This first session is going to explore legislative complexities, market factors, and infrastructure gaps. To lead the discussion and to do our introductions, please join me in welcoming Ahmed Samir Elbermbali, who is a sustainable mobility expert. And he joins us here today, our moderator for this session. Let's give him a nice warm welcome. And now, it's a great pleasure to welcome our panel. Please put your hands together for Michael Cicilio, Principal at AT Kearney Middle East. We also have Mark Notkin, the CIO of Petromin. We also have Claas Bracklo, Chairman of CharIN. Jean-Luc de Paola-Galloni, who is the Corporate Vice President of External Affairs and Sustainable Development at Valeo. And Uday Khemka, who is the Vice Chairman of Sun Group. A very warm welcome. Let's give them a huge round of applause. And I'd just like to very quickly ask you to make sure that you're aligned with your photograph.
Good morning, everyone. Okay. My friend.
Is it probably one? I'm not.
Yeah. I think that's fine. Yeah, we can get started. It should be fine. I think it's easy for you to distinguish who is who, right? I don't think it's very confusing. We don't have twins, at least on the panel. So good morning, everyone. So I'm very happy to kickstart the conference today with this opening panel. So the idea of this opening panel is to set the scene for the 3 days. We have 5 experts from across the value chain of the EV industry. I would say we have 5 of the top, to not exaggerate, maybe out of the top 15 experts globally in terms of their influence and expertise. So I'm very glad to be joined, to join you and learn from you throughout the next few minutes. So what we'll try to cover across this coming 50 minutes or so is understand what's happening in the global landscape in terms of technology, finance, and policy. So, and we will try to map this to the region. Like when I say the region, I mean the GCC region, and see what are the key differences. How can we learn from the expertise of those countries who have been doing this for a long time? And what are the gaps and opportunities as well that you as companies and investors could also look at? And maybe just before I start, the EV growth over the last few years has shown tremendous growth. I think last year we achieved 14 million vehicles, which EVs, which again, year over year, that's almost 30% annual growth. And this is continue to be the case as well. And this growth is not only happening across the EVs, and when I say EVs, it's not just light-duty vehicles, but we mean EVs across the whole different modes. 2- and 3-wheelers, and we'll speak about this and what's happening in India as one of the case successful stories for 2- and 3-wheelers, but also we talk about heavy-duty and medium-duty vehicles as well. So electrification is happening literally across the whole different modes of transportation. Same thing is happening with infrastructure. I think infrastructure deployment has been going very fast. We'll speak about some of the numbers and the trends as well. And I think today there will be a launch. His Excellency mentioned the launch of UAEV, which will happen later today, which again shows that the growth that will happen is already happening in the region, and we expect it to be even more. So all of this is building the ecosystem. I think it's when we talk about EVs, that's not just the vehicle. It's building a whole ecosystem that's very different from the traditional automotive sector. So to get started with this, I would like to start with you, Michael. So when I talk to consultants, I think they usually understand the world before people does, because you work with the clients and the government to set the policies, set the strategies. So if you can walk us through what do you see as the key global trends when it comes to electrification? And what do you see are the trends specifically when it comes to the policies and technology? And if you map this to the region here, do you see anything that's very different? Do you see opportunities that are present here that maybe everyone can capitalize on as well?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. So first of all, it's a pleasure to exchange ideas with such a great panel of experts. There are many topics to discuss. I'll try to be brief because it's a very broad question. So we see many things in the market, in the e-mobility market, actually. First of all, if we start from the technology. Technology, what we see is that technology is quite mature, and we all know that. It's also becoming more and more cost competitive versus ICE technology, which is one of the most important aspects in the beginning for the deployment of the e-mobility services and infrastructure, actually. We are seeing what many OEMs are doing on the Asian side, so many Asian OEMs are quite aggressive, also on the price and the cost of the assets themselves. And also, we all know that from an operations and maintenance perspective, actually costs of the e-mobility is lower than the ICE technology. But nevertheless, the cost competitiveness is quite important. What we see here in the Middle East is actually technology has to perform in the Middle East conditions. We know how there is heat here, there is sand, and so on. So what we are seeing in talking to our clients is that in order to deploy the technology properly, it has to be efficient in these conditions. And also, in this case, infrastructure plays a very important role. While I'm talking about all the depot, maintenance centers, all the parking areas that enable the assets to be maintained and preserved. So this is point number one. Then we spoke a lot about demand. So we all know that demand is growing. It's actually growing double digits here in the region and globally. Customers are more and more sophisticated, actually. It's not only about costs. They are looking for options to replace ICE technology. It's about safety, reliability, battery autonomy, and so on and so forth. But the key question here is who are actually the customers. It's not only us as individuals, as families that are looking into having an electric vehicle, but actually in the region, one of the main drivers of demand is the B2B segment. We are talking about, of course, cities, municipalities, regions, countries, giga projects, companies. These entities are looking into establishing public and private mobility networks, and they are driving demand quite a bit, and it's very important for the region itself, for the deployment of the e-mobility. And last but not least, demand is growing. However, there are some challenges what we see is that there are some challenges from the supply side and in the manufacturing processes, so there has been some challenge to cope with the demand growth from a supply side, and this generates some lead times in getting the assets and the electric vehicles We can talk about cars, we can talk about buses and so on, for example. And this has to be taken into account, in particular from the B2B sector. In order to activate these services, it might take a bit of time before they get executed on the ground. So having said that, as a summary, how we see, let's say, the Middle East being one of the key leading ecosystems globally. There are a lot of initiatives that started already, but in order to continue this, first of all, the customer adoption is important, as I mentioned. There are a lot of policies and regulations that can be put in place in order to push this on the B2C and B2B side. Then infrastructure is, of course, important. Not only physical infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure and integration, because implicitly these services need to be connected and seamless because they are innovative. So customers want these services to be connected and seamless, as I said. And then the localization of the ecosystem is also important. We are seeing how the countries here in the Middle East are looking into that, because this is very important in order to, of course, create GDP, employment, but also localize capabilities that can help the ecosystems develop going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michel. I think that gives a very good landscape. And maybe because of the context of also of what His Excellency mentioned about the infrastructure. So if we'll out of all of this, we dive a little bit deeper in the infrastructure. And this question for you, Claas, I think last year we have seen, as I mentioned earlier, the growth of the EV charging deployment globally, especially the public charging. So yes, end of last year, total of the deployed public chargers, fast and slow, reached 40 million chargers globally. Majority is in China, maybe in Europe and the US as well, not much in the region. But how do you see the trends in the sector of EV charging? And what do you see as would be the forecast in terms of the technology? Is it getting, we'll see faster charging experience and more convenient for people? So what are the trends within the charging infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I'm having a quite good overview about the global deployment of chargers, as CharIN is within 9 different regions of the world represented. And we see the combination of funding together with regulation. And so, for example, the Biden administration is spending $7.5 billion into charging infrastructure to support that growth rate of vehicles, because there is some interdependency. The European Union is going to regulation, so they are demanding the member states to deliver some amount of kilowatt per vehicle on the streets. So that is a direct attachment vehicles to chargers. And so I'm from Germany. The German government spent $2 billion into the infrastructure on the main autoroutes. So we see that balance of funding and demanding. The technology is currently quite mature. So we have out of that 40 million chargers worldwide. We have around 3 million public chargers, and public charging is that what goes to the governmental aspects and to the use of frequent travelers. For that, we have this mature charging technology called CCS, a combined charging system, which is going to deploy it. And what we see in the world markets, and it's going to higher power. So when we started with charging, that was a multi-city application, mega-city vehicles, small ones, small distances. We now see the technology is competitive in distance. We see bigger batteries. And for the global quotes of charger installation, we see a lower limit of 150 kilowatts, which enables the vehicle to be charged in half an hour for a longer drive. And with that assumptions and reality, we see that the EVs are coming close to the ordinary use case of ICE vehicles, and that makes it somehow attractive to the end customer. We see $100 billion market till 2030, and roughly between 30 and 35% growth rate in the charging industry. And what helps a lot is the availability of global standards. So that is a clear sign to invest. There is no risk, there is no debate about what is a preferred technology. So everything is clear, the vehicles are coming, and the charging volume has to follow the EVs, which are, so roughly said, 40% is going to China, 20% Europe, 10% the US, and there's some room for the MENA region to cover the rest of the percentage. And all these regions are investing heavily to support the growth rate of vehicles and to support these market rollout with chargers.
Amazing. So I think what Michael and Claas did, Uday, is I think now we have a picture, but it's black and white. So if you can paint that picture for us, like all of this, what's happening today, how can we take it off? How can actually this transition be accelerated in a sustainable way? And it's just everyone has access to an EV, everyone has access to finance to enable that fleet transition to happen as well. And the right technology is existent, etc. So what is needed from where we are today to really take off the transition so we have EVs just for the mass market?
Thank you, Ahmed. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Wonderful to be with you. I completely agree with my predecessor speakers. One of the things that's key to understand in all our discussions is the systemic nature of what needs to happen. And the way I like to put it is if you think about the old fossil fuel system we have today, it's a very complex interdependent system. You have the exploration guys, the refining, the pipeline, the petrol stations, the engines developed over 100 years. We have to do that within 5 to 10 years. And that's a complexity and interdependence problem. And it strikes me there are three main challenges to the mass deployment of EV. One is there's a huge capital outlay. Now, in the case of the US government and the German government, it's possible for the state to take the leadership fiscally, and maybe here in Abu Dhabi. But for many, many, many countries, the scale of the outlay on charging infrastructure, but also on this new generation of transport assets is going to be enormous, of a scale that, put together with the power transition, is very difficult. Secondly, there is still a green premium. We heard about the diminishing cost, but even with that diminishing cost, there's still a green premium up front. Now, TCO, we're getting to parity, but many countries, particularly emerging markets, and MENA has two different kinds of countries, doesn't it? Some very wealthy, high per capita countries, but also many countries that are still emerging countries. And for them, upfront high prices is difficult. And the third is the interdependency problem, the chicken and egg problem. You have the infrastructure without the buses. If you have the demand signal, but on the other hand, the supply chain is not in place, if the regulations are not in place, it doesn't work. So working with, I wear two hats. I'm vice chairman of an Indian and global business group that invests in the energy transition. But I also, I'm not wearing that hat today. I'm wearing the hat of managing trustee of a foundation that's focused on bringing sovereign wealth fund capital, pension capital, endowment capital to these infrastructure categories. We've worked on this for about 17 years. And we've looked at both the buy side and the sell side on how to do this. And we are convinced that the only way to do this, bringing in this huge capital, is to de-risk so that private scale institutional capital can fund this infrastructure. Now, most in the emerging countries of this investment is going in as private equity money, which has a very high required rate of return. But that's not how the United States was built. It was built on bond returns. So to do that, we need to reduce the risk to infrastructure-like equity returns. Now, people talk about blended finance as one way to do that. There's a very small amount of blended finance on the planet. So what we need to do is fundamental de-risking. And in the next section, maybe I can explain what I mean. Working with these sovereign wealth funds, we believe there's a methodology to do that, bringing together investors, industry, regulators to de-risk and promote, accelerate this systemic change. Some small points that are important are the aggregation of demand that can reduce a price premium, the consolidation and coordination of the system. But even with all of this, the premium upfront will remain. And in Norway, that may not matter because TCOs match. But in emerging countries, it does. And that's where we need new technology models like the battery swapping and other things that we may talk about later. So it needs to have this systemic approach, coordinated approach, if we want to do in 10 years what took 100 years to do in the fossil fuel industries.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think this is very clear as well. And if you look, if we try to stick with the traditional way of regulating vehicles, that doesn't work with the EVs. I think today, like normally you wouldn't have the Undersecretary of Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure speaking at a vehicle conference. But because of the nature of that whole new ecosystem, and I think that's a complicated point because we'll come back to this one again. So the policy making for this will be complicated as well because who is regulating the vehicle as infrastructure and the charging? Who is regulating the registration of these vehicles? Some countries in the region, it took them actually 5 years to identify which category an EV falls under because they work with the CC and all of this. And all of this new technology is not known for them. So how can you also educate the policymakers so you set a very clear policy scheme that's clear for everyone and also be up to date so they understand the new technologies and can adapt to it. So that is very clear. So I think what I would like to ask you, Jean-Luc, in this case is, I think what we have been seeing clearly is there's a huge increase in the demand for EVs for different reasons. We spoke about some of them. But what's happening on the supply side? Valeo is one of the largest tier 1 suppliers for the OEMs. So I want to understand from your side, have you seen the OEMs taking, because I have spoken to many of them and I don't see that they are actually moving with the speed that they should be moving at. So do you think they are moving with the speed that would enable them to, one, meet the targets that they put for themselves, whether to reduce their emissions, be net zero, whatever targets they have put for themselves. Two is to meet the demand, the global demand, regardless of the region. So what's happening on the OEM side?
Well, very good morning also from myself. I hope it works.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Thanks for having me here. I will actually answer also depending on which region. There are some fundamental trends that are valid worldwide, but then there are very regional trends. And as a global supplier, you need to address the differences of the markets. First of all, I would like to emphasize what Michele said, which is very right. I think there is competitiveness everywhere to some extent. And the advance that's been taken from the #1 worldwide market, which is China, on EV, as I would say pushed and triggered a global player like ourselves, which has European roots, not only what was the principle of China 20, 30 years ago, to go cheap and then fast. It's really to innovate with the Chinese roots. And a company like Valeo, if you want to supply Chinese OEMs, you really need to bring forward what the Chinese market needs. And you learn how to be fast forward with just the right price, but with the right innovation. If I can go even further on the last speaker, we are a supplier, for example, of Indian tuk-tuk, of rickshaws. If you want to electrify India, you're going to start by the three-wheelers, by the rickshaws. There is a fantastic market there, which addresses exactly what our last speaker said. With the very low price, at a frugal level of innovation, it's certainly not the kind of market that would be interesting for Europe or America. But if you're able to provide an electric motor below $100 for equivalent rupees, well, you're winning the market. And now Valeo is the #2, #3 electric solution supplier for Indian OEMs of rickshaws. Then, if I come to Europe and America, for sure there has been a great push thanks to regulation. And in America, as we all know, it started with the great work with UCLA and UC at Davis, who has developed the regulation for California, then that was inspired at Washington, D.C., and deployed mainly on the coasts and the lakes and the big cities. And in Europe, clearly, with the European Commission, it has been a post after the diesel scandal, where really there has been a huge push for EV. At that time, the regulatory and what you said, the fiscal push has helped. But now, not in every region, we have the same amount. The states don't have, or the cities or the regions don't have the same power of money. So also there, you need to provide solutions that are industrially affordable on a B2B business when you want to supply American or European-based OEMs. And now you have the introduction of the new non-European, non-American players entering European and American markets where you need to compete with the right price. So competitiveness is really, to me, the most important factor to succeed if you want to have a supply chain where respecting the competition and at the same time the regulation. At the same time, you need to have a fair policy. I mean, indeed, Europe is reacting because we need to provide and save what is the European supply chain of electric motorization. We can't lose the industrialization that has been taken there. The same goes with the Americas, so to speak, where you have an integrated supply chain between Mexico, Canada, and the US on the market. In the MENA region, what is very interesting and exciting is because of the regional localization. Here, it is a very beginning, and we've listened to the figure of His Excellency, and I can only wish the best from here as a takeoff. What is interesting is that here you're in the middle of very close to very automotive regions such as Turkey, which are not so far, with a lot of software developments and new partners such as Egypt, Israel, to some extent with software and cybersecurity, and then close to India as well. And from here, when you want to build a new supply chain, such as, for example, Valeo, where we have 3,000 engineers in Egypt that I want to salute, well, we can build some software on power electronics that is needed in this region. We can use some industrial facilities that are in India or potentially in Turkey, and then conglomerate and have a supply chain. This is also how some classical and powerful players are seeing the region, and then when the market uptakes, then we can install some factories also in the region here in the Arabic Peninsula. Yep. So I think there is a very good trend, but again, the focus is really on the regional competitiveness everywhere.
Yeah, fully agree. I think one key point as well, which a lot of companies are now starting to realize, is how much talent this region have, which is very capable of building a whole industry, not just like on the policy side, but the technology side as well, across the whole value chain. And I want to come to you, Mark. I think everyone is looking at Saudi with all of the mega projects and the giga projects as well, but it's not very clear what's happening on the EV side. I think if we take Electromin as an example, now, what I understand about Electromin is you're building the whole ecosystem, not just focusing on the charging or the vehicle, building an ecosystem. So if you walk us through what you do within Electromin, and maybe that would give people a snapshot of what's happening in the Saudi market.
Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you also for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here. Good morning. Let me start with Saudi first. Just we need to zoom out to understand the big picture. So the Vision 2030 defines the objectives. One of the key objectives of Saudi Arabia is economical diversification. That element plays really a fundamental key role. Diversification means a way or reduce the dependency on oil, right? And establish other industries. Automotive sector is one of those. Within the automotive sector, the government is undertaking different initiatives, and one of those is to establish its own automotive industry. So the backbone of this local automotive industry will be electric mobility. Mm-hmm. We know Lucid, right? We've got SEER. There will be other announcements coming soon. That is the industry rumor saying, right? Now, we have to look at that and understand that government is focusing currently at establishing the industry rather than subsidizing the retail, right, and subsidizing the demand. Yep. If that is clear, then the next conclusion is actually Obviously, there is not much currently happening in Saudi in the area of in sales, in terms of selling vehicles as a predominant factor of electric mobility. We have heard an hour back numbers from UAE that 11 or 12%, I didn't capture it exactly, of the total industry volume here is electric. In Saudi Arabia, the official statistics do not exist, but I would dare to say that the share of electric vehicles, at least when we speak about the passenger car market, will be 0 point something in 2023. So we are talking about probably less than 2,000 vehicles, passenger vehicles, delivered to customers in 2023. In the area of commercial mobility, the numbers are also quite basic, and we as Elbermbali, with our affiliated company in TSC, we are the pioneers in that. So we were the first one to launch electric mobility. We were the first one to supply buses to the Red Sea Global or to PepsiCo, etc., etc. Now, that is for me the context, right? Within this context, we live as a private entity. So being a private entity, at the end, it's all about funds, it's all about financials, it's all about crunching numbers and making profits. Because this is the core objective of doing business. Now, we started with electric mobility 3 years back, and I have probably to still say some few words on what is Elbermbali, and Elbermbali is a part of Petromin Corporation, right? Petromin Corporation is a multi-billion-dollar corporation in Saudi Arabia, actually what was built across the entire automotive sector, right? And we have got, as part of Petromin Corporation, quite a big number of, so to say, captive customers. Captive customers, for example, we've got 700 outlets, what are called Petromin Express. That's fast lane services in Saudi Arabia. That's the biggest chain of fast lane services in the world. We have got petrol stations, we have got Stellantis showrooms, we have got Nissan's showrooms, Volvo, etc., etc. We have got unprecedented number of after-sales facilities in commercial, in passenger sector, etc. That's for Elbermbali captive customers. Can we electrify them tomorrow? We can. Would it make sense? No, it wouldn't. Why? Because we are, again, back into the discussion chicken or egg. Are there vehicles on the roads? No, they are not. So would it make sense to establish for us as a private company charging infrastructure? It wouldn't. We did it. When we established the company, we did build, at that time, the largest network of charging devices. So where did we install the chargers? We installed them at our premises. Do we sell energy? No. Why we don't do that? Because at the end, still, the demand is absolutely low, right? We are technically prepared to do that, but if I switch it on now, I don't know what is going to happen, because I don't want to discourage people. I still want to encourage them. So basically now about ecosystem. The ecosystem, and that is the beginning of your question, but I just answered it in a different sequence. So the ecosystem where we started from was electric charging infrastructure and solutions around that, from A to Z, whatever you want. So CPO, etc., selling chargers, establishing chargers, operating all that networks. That was the first cornerstone. Then we relatively soon understood that it's financially not working, right? Because also the government at the end is targeting different objectives, right? Because the sequence is different. I hope I was able to explain it. Second pillar was what we have established is selling commercial vehicles. We're exclusive distributor of several commercial brands. including autonomous shuttle, buses, etc. So also there, the demand is extremely slow. We are at present probably, and I guess I would not be lying, we are the only supplier now in Saudi Arabia of electric commercial fleets, right? Who has got vehicles on the ground.
Because it makes sense now, or because you want to explore?
It makes sense now because the market is picking up, but very slowly. What numbers are we talking about? Not even hundreds. So we're talking about the numbers what you per month could count on both hands, right? We're in a very, very early baby stage. Then, okay, we understood that commercial mobility is taking, again, a little bit longer. We decided to set another milestone and stepped into passenger car vehicles market, right? Now, the story is pretty much the same.
Yep.
So last but not least, we are developing now, we stepped into public transportation, right? Because public transportation in particular areas in Saudi Arabia makes sense even from a perspective of being a private investor, right? You know that public mobility is a challenging, a financially challenging area, so less than 30% of global projects can financially survive without donations and subsidies from the government. So we managed to do that. But in two geographic cities where there is constant demand, and there are two such cities in Saudi Arabia. And last but not least, for me, understanding of the ecosystem means also geographical expansion. We expanded now to India, right? Because India, in terms of electrification, is a much more promising market.
Yeah, and we will come back to India.
We will come back, but that is for me then the ecosystem. So the sustainability of the ecosystem
very clear.
Needs to be based on financials.
Agreed. We'll come back to the finance point as well. I think just a key point you highlighted, and I need to comment on, which is about the public transportation. So all of this panel, and I think most of the discussions throughout the whole 3 days will focus on electrification. But that does not mean this is the only way for us to actually solve the climate challenge. Like transport, even if we electrify every single vehicle today, that's not enough to reduce the emission budget for the transportation sector. Again, even if we electrify every single vehicle on the road today, that's not enough to save the emission budget for the transportation sector to be aligned with the 1.5 degrees. That means we need to avoid transportation where we can, and we need to shift to more sustainable and shared mobility modes as well. So we speak about electrification as one of the key enablers, but we need to also not neglect what avoid and shift would potentially impact they would potentially have. So, Mikhail, I want to go back to you, and I think now this provides a very good landscape with a zoom in on Saudi. But there are key differences between the different countries, especially when it comes to policies. EU, one of the key enablers was the fiscal incentives, because they are able to have a tax system, so they can actually put tax returns, etc. So here in the region, you don't have this income tax. You cannot give people tax back, and accordingly, the room for actually fiscal incentives might be a little bit tight. So what is the role of policies, and what are the innovative policy mechanisms that you have seen elsewhere that could be perhaps replicated here? And let's try to keep the answers short so we get another round.
I'll try. I'll do my best. So indeed, there is a lot to talk about policies, regulations, incentives. It's a very broad topic. I would say, as you mentioned, everybody, when talking about this topic, thinks about financial incentives. And this can be tax exemptions, subsidies for EV purchase, of course. This can go up to free services, free parking, free charging, and all of that. What we have seen in Europe, in other countries, is the following. These are more, I would say, short to medium-term solutions, and they are usually used when the EV adoption is quite low. We have seen many countries removing these incentives once the adoption goes up. also because some of these countries don't have the budget to sustain these incentives for so long. But indeed, there is an inverse correlation between these two. So I would say some of these measures actually have been already introduced also in the UAE. If we think about, as I mentioned, free tolls, free parking, free electricity for some period of time, and also in the Middle East. So there is a range of these incentives that can be introduced, but nevertheless, I would say, are they important? Yes, but I would focus a bit more on the policy side, on the regulation side, because this is where the difference can be made in a sense. From the infrastructure side, for example, we are seeing a lot of policies, a lot of regulation to make sure that the infrastructure develops properly and accordingly. For example, being more easy for the customer to have access to charging. If you think about, there are some countries that are introducing a regulation to have every charging point in new residential buildings, in new commercial buildings, in every fuel station, or regulation about parking to make parking more convenient for EVs. So this is all about, indeed, not only making the service affordable, but also convenient, and this is very important. This can go up to something more extreme, in a way, to ban completely the ICE vehicles. This is what, for example, has been announced by many European countries and European Union by 2035, where, let's say, it is planned for the ICE technology not to be sold and vehicles not to be registered anymore. Of course, this is a roadmap, I would say, and this roadmap can be deployed in very different ways. It's not black or white. You can think about gradual banning the ICE technology. We were talking about public transportation, for example. That could be an initial starting point. So municipalities, cities can think about gradually banning all the ICE technology, having all the public transportation green, and so on and so forth. You can think about different types of vehicles, for example. You can start from motorcycles, motorbikes, light commercial vehicles, and then get to passenger vehicles. So what I'm trying to say is that also from this point of view, there are different scales of gray, let's say, and this can be gradual. It has to be gradual, but also, I would say, ambitious in order to, and we know how this region is ambitious in order to reach these targets. But nevertheless, this has already started here in the region. The countries, the Middle Eastern countries are already looking into this. And we are confident that in the next 5 years, at least, we will see more and more on this going forward for implementing the e-mobility.
Absolutely. I think just one small thing to add as well. I think we tend to undermine the size of the fleet owned by the government in the region. So getting started by electrifying their own fleet, that would create a huge demand also. And I think will give a strong signal to the market that the government is actually willing to take the initiative. I want to move to you, Uday. I think finance is sometimes not discussed when we talk about the energy transition as a whole, and transportation under that umbrella in specific. And I think people, when finance is discussed, they think about the interest rate if I want to buy my own vehicle from the retail. But finance in general, as a wider topic, how finance could enable the transition to happen faster. And you mentioned the case of India, which is, I think, one of the smartest ways of how this innovative financing mechanism could actually make the transition faster.
So we talked earlier, and we've been talking about this, the scale of this transition, the cost of this transition, the fact that the private sector capital flows must, at the end of the day, take the bulk of the burden, even if government takes a little initial promotional activity. Now, how do we do this? Luckily, on the planet, there are, because we had 20 years of very low interest rates, huge pools of sovereign wealth fund and pension fund capital that is looking for the kind of steady returns that EV infrastructure and EV transport assets can offer. But that's where there's a mismatch. Because of all these coordination issues that we discussed earlier, there's a mismatch, and it gets funded at private equity rates of return. So working with 45 sovereign wealth funds and pension funds over the last 5 years, we convened again and again and again and again at the COP28 and the G7 in Munich and in Brussels to look at how we could bring tens of billions of dollars to this problem. And what we realized was, and we saw what was worked in countries like the Colombian bus program, the Scottish bus program. We actually took municipal buses as a case study to look at that. Why? Because it has some peculiar public-private characteristics. And what worked, and in India, and what we came to is a framework, which I'll spend 2 minutes on, which is what we call the 3x5. And what is the 3x5? It is fundamentally a de-risking process to allow scale-up and low cost of capital and to allow funds to flow. So what is that? What are the three? The three are certainly the operators and OEMs, government, both the fiscal incentive providers, the regulators, and the local city governments, and investors, working together ab initio to look at the entire process. Step one, 3x5, step one is that government announces clear targets and doesn't keep messing around with the targets. We saw what happened recently in some unnamed European countries. But you have to be consistent, and you have to be clear, and you have to set chronologically based targets with some, hopefully, regulatory teeth. We call that stage one. Stage two is more important, but stage one is very important, which is the coordination of what you talked about, the importance of regulation. For buses, there's a new model, of course, that it's not a CapEx model for the cities, it's an OpEx model with mobility purchase agreements and transportation PSCs. You call them in Europe, we call them GCCs in India. But whereby the private sector owns the transportation assets and provides mobility as a service. For that, the contracts have to work. And if there's a challenge, there has to be a good regulator, a good adjudication process, a payment security mechanism if there's a delayed payment. All of this is what we call stage two coordination. Stage two coordination also happens at the industrial and sectoral level. The OEMs and supply chain folks have to be talking with the operators, have to be talking to the target setters. So in the case of buses, this can even be as specific as routes. From Rotterdam to Germany, there are certain routes. Getting that right for freight, for example. It becomes quite granular, the coordination process. So this is stage two. Stage three is what we call pipeline development. So funders don't just fund anything, they fund projects that have well thought out, put together. And for example, many people I've found in the transportation world don't even understand the structures of investment trusts. So putting together investment trusts correctly, which are yield structures, and making sure we've got all the de-risked elements of that put together, almost like project financing. Stage four is then when we bring in the blended finance, the concessional finance, particularly in emerging markets, that the World Bank in its Marrakesh process, or the Stern-Songwe process, or the Bridgetown Initiative are talking about. There's a very little amount of that available, so we must use it effectively for what we call residual risk. All these other things can be de-risked upstream. And stage five is that we send the right kind of deal flow to the right kinds of investors. We're not wasting time. Some goes to strategic, some to pension funds, some to venture capital. So this is a framework that we're discussing all over the world, and we believe we can massively accelerate the scale-up of the flow of capital to the industries.
How many buses we have as a result now in India?
In India?
Buses? Yeah.
Well, we've launched a program of 50,000 buses based on this.
Yeah.
And we've realized that the private intercity opportunity is even bigger, for 200,000. So it's going in segments of 10,000 buses each. And will after, I think, China be the second largest program. That doesn't mean it's perfect. A lot of this has been done in India by this coordinated process, but it wasn't completed. And so now it's being completed, and we've worked with payment security mechanisms with the US government, the Indian government. It's a lot of hard tooling that needs to be put in place very quickly if we want to meet our decarbonization targets.
Fully agree. I think this is very much needed as well. I think if you look at the data, the cost of capital in emerging markets, if they want to go green, if they want to transition to sustainable modes of transportation, sometimes it's even 7 times what the cost will be in developed countries, which is unfair. You would expect it to be the opposite. So de-risking those markets by providing this kind of mechanism, I think, is the right move to go. And I hope this will be replicated in other markets across the region and in Africa and other regions as well. Thank you, Uday. I think I want to move back to technology. We have very limited time, so let's try to keep it fast. So for you, Claas, I think 5 years ago, we had like Dubai Taxi here, for example. They had a fleet of EVs. They used to charge every car for like 5-6 hours. For a fleet, that's a huge loss of money and time. And the charging speed is getting faster and faster. So what's happening in the technology of charging, and also wider landscape in terms of the speed of charging, megawatt charging, we talk about now megawatt charging, and also V2G and the stuff like this. What's happening in the charging technology?
Yeah, thanks for that. I try to answer it quite quickly as I see the running time. And so what you mentioned, to create the ecosystem, that is a big challenge. And that is what we are doing within CharIN, as we have the major industry aligned. And so we don't need the government at all if we could achieve to align on the technology. And so the technology evolved to quicker charging speeds, as I mentioned. So we are coming to a 10 minutes, 20 minutes recharge time. That is going to be automated. So we have that functionality called plug and charge. You plug in. The processes of charging and billing are done automatically, and that means so we are coming close to the ICE technology and to the customer expectation, and as an added value, so we can do that a bit more intelligent, just to pump fuel into the tank. So that could go in both directions. So that is a big advantage, and also driven from the bus industry. So they have these wonderful use case to have a 5 days a week travel time. They have night and weekend, and they have that big storage. And that already happens in that market, and that does not happen typically in Europe or US. So that is in Chile, that is in Colombia, that is in India, and to make use of that asset. So we have the Dutch. That is the city of Utrecht, so they are starting to implement. If you want to enter the city, you have to give service to the city, give us a part of the energy to support the city needs. And that is a very, very complicated ecosystem, and that is what we try to harmonize within CharIN so that we speak the same language. That has a lot to do with IT technology, software, communication, telecommunication, and that is a big challenge to all of us to combine these different aspects of different industries. But we need that. It's a bit more complex, but we are on a good way to have that. As you mentioned, the megawatt charging, that was an initiative we started 4 years ago, as we have seen the demand of CO2 neutral transport for truck transport. So we asked the society, what do we need? Okay, we need a megawatt charging power to fill the battery in that time the driver has as a break time. And so we created the system, we aligned that. And that is a wonderful perspective to have this industry-driven technology, the demand of supporting those markets together with creating this overall ecosystem. And these two trends are, so we are going to higher charging speeds to make it more convenient, and to make use of the battery power we have when the vehicle is not driving. That is incredible work behind of that, if that goes to energy systems and vehicle interconnection. But whoever could solve that, then CharIN and the strengths of the industry with many of the oil industry partners already member. And so we're supposed to have the right setup for having that. If we get the capital in, it works.
There will be two couple of sessions dedicated on charging. I think we'll dive deeper on the topic as well. Just Jean-Luc, briefly as well, that's on the charging. Anything that's happening on the powertrain side, you're aware of that? I know OEMs sometimes they delay the technology that they might already have until the market is ready for it. So anything that's happening in the background that you might be aware of, that we should be aware of as well?
Well, the delays are also cause of the demand. So clearly, yes, we do have clients that are postponing their projects. It's happening all over the world. I mean, mainly in Europe, as we all know. I would say our burden, but it's also our challenge, and we like it, is really to provide the best solution at the best cost. It's really what the supply chains are doing, and keeping the quality. As a head of sustainability in my group, what I want to insist beyond what we've said here on finance and regulation, let's not forget that beyond the decarbonization through electrification, we need to ensure the circularity of the economy. This is extremely important. It's financial, it's strategic. I think this region has a great asset. I mean, you mentioned it, the wind and the sun. So at least you can also move from very strong oil-based region to a very strong decarbonized energy as well. But let's not forget how to reuse the waste, how to reuse the materials. I mean, we are challenging ourselves to reuse the cores and the cases of metallic powertrains to reuse. You cannot just build as new. This is the new mantra. It's extremely important, and it's also part to reducing the cost, which was your original question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we will. I think so far we have been innovating on what we know. Like so far the vehicle has not been very different from what people traditionally know. I think we'll see more innovation and new types of modes that will emerge as a result of this. I want to conclude the panel with you, Mark. You mentioned what's happening in Saudi, what's happening with Petromin and now Electromin, also with the ecosystem. Just for everyone who's actually considering also going to the Saudi market, what can you tell them about the opportunities that might exist? Partnering with companies like you, there might be a gap in the infrastructure and other modes of transportation that there's an opportunity as a result for people to consider looking at.
It's a very challenging question. Look, reality is that I believe the automotive market, especially with regard to electric segment, will probably flourish around the end of this decade. So currently the numbers are very low.
Yeah.
So that creates pressure on one hand on the charging infrastructure area as well as the challenge on the automotive distributors in terms of pushing what technology, combustion engines, what are still in very high demand, or electric vehicles, right, what are still even a little bit more expensive than the combustion vehicles. So because at the end, the distributors and the practical implementers, they look at it from the demand perspective. If the demand is not there, then it doesn't matter what you do.
Yep.
Unless you have got public funds behind you, what could make your journey a little bit longer. If not, then it's all about really crunching the numbers, understanding what you do, finding the right niche, and in our case, establishing an ecosystem, and this ecosystem actually avoid standing on one foot. That is my message. For us, the second foot, sorry, I'm repeating myself, is India for now. So, and I believe with that, we are stable. If we would stay with what we have started with, right, charging infrastructure, only public charging infrastructure, in the absence of vehicles on the roads, it would have been really quite a challenging, financially challenging exercise.
Absolutely. I think that that's a good conclusion, and that's a good teaser also. There is a panel also dedicated on Saudi, so I think that's on day 3, if I'm not mistaken, so you make sure that you join that. I think we covered the whole landscape. I hope that was helpful. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. We touched on the policy, the technology, finance, and I think there come some really good examples from what has been discussed so far. So if you have any questions to anyone from the panelists, please make sure that you ask us after the panel, and thank you all for listening in. Thank you.